Listen to the Tommy Schnurmacher Show, live weekdays 9 to noon on CJAD 800 and CJAD.com.
With the holidays behind us, your wallet probably feeling a little lighter. You might be wondering if you went a little overboard. Well, the reason for that overspending might not be what you think it is. Here with me to talk about why we buy what we buy is Dr. Gat SAAD, a professor of marketing at Concordia, author of The Consuming Instinct, What the Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift Giving Reveal About Human Nature. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well. Dr. SAAD, tell me, what is evolutionary consumption? What does that mean?
So evolutionary consumption is basically the idea of looking at how fundamental biological drives affect our behaviors in contemporary settings. And so we could explain why we have opposable thumbs from an evolutionary perspective, but we could also explain, using evolutionary theory, why we've evolved the brains that we have, and then how those forces manifest themselves within the consumer realm.
Well, tell me about some of that in the consumer realm. When you go shopping yourself, what part of your work do you bring with you? What are you watching if you're in a department store?
Well, I'm trying to convince my wife that since I've just hit midlife crisis, I need to buy a Porsche to regulate my testosterone levels. But she hasn't bought into that story yet.
Right, but you've done all the research to prove that's true.
I have actually. A few years ago with one of my graduate students, we brought young males and had them drive either a Porsche or a sort of beaten up old sedan downtown Montreal where everybody could see you, or on a semi-deserted highway. And after each of the driving conditions, we collected salivary assays so that we could then measure their fluctuating levels of testosterone. And you're probably not going to be surprised by this. You put a young male in a Porsche, his endocrinological system completely explodes. And it's precisely because it's a sexual signal. It's akin to immediately infusing me with social status, and that always causes a rise in my T levels.
Now, not everyone is a fan of your work. Are some people upset by some of the research you're doing?
A very long list. So you have, for example, social constructivists. Those are people who argue that what makes us human is that we transcend our biology. So don't use evolutionary mechanisms that are relevant to the zebra and the mosquito and the elephant to explain our behaviors. So that's one gang. Radical feminists will hate my work because as soon as you argue that there are innate sex differences, that's a big no-no. Postmodernists will hate my work because they think that everything is relative. There are no universal truths. Theologians will hate my work, or religious people, because what do you mean evolution? Where is God in all this? So there's a long, long list of haters.
Oh, yes, but you continue to do it. Now, tell me about some of you mentioned the Porsche, but other things that influence what we buy and how much we buy.
Right. So I did another study with one of my recently graduated doctoral students where we looked at how the menstrual cycle affects women's behaviors. Anecdotally, most of us are well aware that women's behaviors, their moods, their emotions, their desires will change across the menstrual cycle. And so what we wanted to check was whether, specifically in the consumer realm, that might lend itself to an effect. And what we found is that food-related behaviors are much more prominent during the non-fertile phase, whereas beautification, dressing sexily, dressing in a scantily clad manner, occurs most often during the ovulatory phase. Now, that particular finding, you would have never been able to broach it where you're not coming from a biological and evolutionary perspective. So that's one of many other examples.
Can companies use your work to help sell stuff?
Absolutely. So take, for example, the classic conundrum of local versus global advertising. If I am Coca-Cola, I'm headquartered in Atlanta. Should I develop one advertising message that I transport around the world, or should I locally tweak it to each cultural setting? Well, evolutionary psychology allows us to answer that question because there are some things that are absolutely universally the same around the world. So, for example, how we respond to facially symmetric people holds true irrespective of the cultural setting that I come from. However, color connotations, green might be perceived as fertility in one culture, it might be perceived as disease in another. And so navigating through this local versus global divide is really well informed via the evolutionary lens.
What does your birth order reveal about you as a consumer? Will you spend differently if you're an only child or if you're the oldest child?
Right. So maybe I could step back and give you the background to this.
Yeah.
So Frank Soloway, a historian of science, proposed a really radical idea relating to birth order. He argued that when kids are born, they want to, if you like, occupy a unique niche in their parents' eyes. I want to be the rebel. I want to be the good boy. And so the first kid comes along, all of the niches are unoccupied. So he picks whichever niche he wants. As you go down the SIP ship, there are fewer and fewer niches open.
Right.
And so you have to be, if you like, open to solving this really important adaptive problem so that later children are more likely to be non-conforming, open to novelty, to new experiences. So I took this idea and I applied it to the consumer setting and found that firstborns were much more likely to be conforming. They care about what other people think when they're buying stuff and so on, whereas the later borns are much more likely to be the radical product innovators and the ones who accept these radical products.
And this has been proven in your research?
It has been proven in my research, a 2005 Journal of Business Research article.
Your questions for Dr. Gatsad, his book. He's a professor of marketing at Concordia University. His book is called The Consuming Instinct, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift Giving Reveal About Human Nature. How did you get involved in this work in the first place?
Oh, thank you. Great question. So first semester as a doctoral student in 1990, it scares me to say that it's almost 25 years ago. I took a advanced social psychology course. This was at Cornell University. This wasn't an evolutionary psychology course, but halfway through the semester, the professor assigned a book called Homicide by two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, where they looked at patterns of criminality from an evolutionary perspective. Right. So there are certain forms of crime that happen for the exact same reasons, whether you are the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon, or you are in Detroit in the 1950s, or you are in contemporary Montreal. And they provided some incredibly elegant explanations for these otherwise what seemed to be very, very different phenomena. And so when I saw the explanatory power of evolutionary psychology, as applied in this case to criminology, and since I was interested in studying consumer behavior, the eureka moment happened. I thought, okay, well, I'll try to bring in evolutionary psychology to consumer behavior.
We're going to continue our discussion. Does your finger length reveal something about you as a consumer?
Well, the ratio of your fingers. So if you look at, it's called the 2D, 4D ratio. If you look at your index to ring finger ratio, in the case of men, their ring fingers are longer than their index fingers, whereas for women, these two fingers are roughly equal length. You might say, well, how could this be related to anything? It turns out that what regulates that morphological feature is how much testosterone you've been exposed to in utero, in your mother's womb. So the greater the difference in these two fingers, the more you are masculinized. And so what we did in a study a few years ago is we measured people's digit ratios and then measured their risk-taking proclivities and found that only for men, but not women, men who had highly masculinized fingers were much more likely to engage in risk-taking. And the reason for that is because testosterone and risk-taking are intimately linked. The higher my testosterone level, the more I engage in risk-taking.
Your questions for Dr. Gatsad, a professor of marketing at Concordia. This text is saying, not in my case, it's the opposite with me and my brother's buying pattern. When you find a discovery, it says that you're more likely. It doesn't mean that everyone is like
Of course.
that.
So,
yeah.
and the classic example is if you say that men are on average taller than women, that's an absolute biological fact. Now, the fact that there are tons of women who are taller than tons of men doesn't negate the fact at the population level.
You do all kinds of different research. Of all the research projects you've worked on, which conclusion shocked you the most?
Which conclusion shocked me the most? That's a good one. I think going back to the testosterone one study, I was surprised that men's testosterone levels did not change irrespective of whether they drove their Porsche in downtown Montreal or whether they drove it on the semi-deserted highway. I had predicted and did not find that where everybody can see me, downtown Montreal on a weekend, then my testosterone level should rise a lot more. Perhaps I was surprised that it didn't matter. You put a guy in a Porsche, his system explodes.
So I guess it's from his concept of what the Porsche is, right?
Exactly. It's akin to the peacock's tail, right? So all sorts of sexually reproducing species engage in sexual signaling. In the case of humans, we may not use our tails, but our Porsches become our proverbial tails.
How are men and women different in terms of buying patterns? That's a question from Mike. We're going to get the answer to that question, a fascinating subject. My guest is a professor of marketing right here at Concordia University, Dr. Gatsad. His book is called The Consuming Instinct, what juicy burgers, Ferraris, pornography, and gift-giving reveal about human nature. We'll find out more about the title of that book as well. You're listening to the Tommy Schnurmacher Show on CJAD. Dr. Gatsad, my guest, professor of marketing at Concordia. Mike sent us a very interesting question. He said, how are men and women different in terms of buying patterns?
So it depends in what context. There are many things where men and women are not different. They both love fatty burgers with an equal alacrity. On the other hand, when it comes to, say, pornography, there is no culture that's ever been uncovered where women are more likely to consume hardcore pornography than men. So it really depends. You can't sort of give a broad statement. It depends on the domain in question.
What about toys? Feminists will often say there's no reason to buy the little baby boy the truck and the baby girl a doll.
Yes.
What research did you find about that?
So I actually used this example precisely to dismantle that whole sort of social constructivist idea. They argue that what makes us male or female is this cascade of gender socialization, which starts off with giving little Tommy blue truck and little Gina the pink doll, and that starts the whole gender socialization story. Complete nonsense. So if you look, for example, at children who are in the pre-socialization stage of their cognitive development, they're too young to be socialized. They already show longer gazing towards sex-specific toys. Boys will look at trucks, girls will look at dolls. If you take other animals, you take vervet and rhesus monkeys, and recently there was a study with chimps, and you look at what they play with, they play using the exact same sex-specific preferences that we do. So it would be difficult to argue that mama chimp and mama a rhesus monkey is engaging in arbitrary, patriarchal, sexist socialization. There are little girls who suffer from a disorder called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is an endocrinological disorder that masculinizes their behaviors and masculinizes their traits. Girls who suffer from this disorder are more likely to have boy-specific toy preferences. So you take all this stuff together and many other examples, and it totally dismantles the idea that it's all due to patriarchal oppression.
This text wants to know, what happened when a woman was put in an expensive, powerful car?
But we didn't do the study with women because we thought that particular cue would be relevant to men. But that certainly could be a future study.
Another texter wants to know, what about Canadian versus American buying patterns?
A very general question. It really depends. So I wouldn't be able to comment unless you gave me a specific domain.
If you have any questions for our guest, Dr. Gatsad is a professor of marketing at Concordia. His book, The Consuming Interest, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift-Giving Reveal About Human Nature. Let's talk about the title. We talked about the juicy burgers and, well, not the Ferraris, but the
the Porsches, yeah.
Yes. Tell me about the gift-giving. What is it?
Right. So I've done several studies looking at how we allocate gifts to the various recipients. And so one of the things that I found is that we are very well modulated to give gifts that correspond to the genetic relatedness between us and the gift recipient. And we don't do this consciously. Earlier we were talking about off air about how some of these forces manifest themselves subconsciously. And this is exactly an example of that. So I'm much more likely to give a larger gift to a brother with whom I share on average 50% of my genes than I am to a second cousin. And so we did a study that demonstrated that. But here's the second part, which is a bit more subtle. So we did a study with Israeli gifts at weddings, Israeli weddings. So if you look at your grandparents, all four grandparents are on average, they share 25% of their genes with you. So you would think that they would be equally invested in you. But if you then look at another phenomenon called genetic assuredness, your maternal grandmother is assured of her link to you genetically. Your paternal grandfather has two sources of paternity uncertainty. So we would expect the maternal grandmother to invest the most, the paternal grandfather to invest the least, and the two other grandparents in the middle. And so we took this exact principle, applied it to Israeli weddings, and found that for both the bride and the groom, the maternal side gave much larger gifts than the paternal side. You could have never come up with that finding where you're not informed from an evolutionary
lens. So the maternal side gives more because they're sure that this is their family.
Exactly right. Even if you think of, for example, Judaism, we were talking off air about some of these issues. Judaism is transmitted to the mother, right? Now, one easy argument from an evolutionary perspective is to the extent that you want to maintain, quote, the integrity of the peoples, well, then you have to do it through the mother side because there you're assured of the genetic lineage.
Fascinating subject. Dr. Gad Saad, my guest, a marketing professor here at Concordia. His book, The Consuming Instinct, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift Giving Reveal About Human Nature. If you have any questions, please join the discussion. Text your question or your comment to 514-800. How do our genes affect our gift-giving patterns? We'll also talk about other research that the professor has done. And when we buy something, is it really because it's the best bargain? Are there factors working on us that we don't know about? We'll get to that as well. You're listening to the Tommy Schnurmacher Show on CJAD. Stay with us. Some fascinating research being conducted by my guest, Dr. Gad Saad. Tell me about men and women, how they judge a man's height.
Right. So we this is an ongoing study with one of my former doctoral students where we created these fictitious online dating profiles and asked men and women to evaluate this guy whose online dating profile we had created. And we had two conditions. In one condition, we put a photo, his favorite possession, as a photo of this red Kia, pretty cheap car. Apologies to all Kia owners, right. Or a fancy red Porsche. And then subsequently, we asked these men and women to rate this gentleman on a whole bunch of metrics. But of relevance to today's conversation, we asked them, how tall do you think this guy was? And it turns out that men, when they're evaluating the guy in the Porsche, denigrate his height. Suddenly he becomes shorter, whereas women elongate his height. So we call this the status elongation and status contraction effect, which is exactly what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective, right? Status is very attractive to women, height is very attractive to women, and so all other things equal, they're likely to see the guy in the Porsche with rosy lenses. On the other hand, to men, it's competition. It's competition, exactly. It's intersexual competition. So who's that little short runt who's riding that Porsche?
Fascinating. Tell me about Darwinian gastronomy.
Yes, that's a great one. So Darwinian gastronomy is basically the idea. That's a perfect example of how culture is itself within the purview of biology. So if you look at different cultures, the amount of salt they consume, whether they have more meat-based foods or vegetable foods, how much spices they use, all of these things are very different across cultures, but they're different for biological reasons. So if you look, for example, at the amount of spices that are used in different cultures, it turns out that it perfectly correlates to how much pathogens there are within that cultural setting. So countries that are a lot warmer, that are closer to the equator, will have greater pathogenic density. And so one of the ways that you mitigate the possible ills of being exposed to food pathogens is to make them more spicy. So rather than simply arguing that things
are for taste,
taste is part of it.
Yes.
So nobody is contesting the fact that your gustatory, buds matter, but to argue that something is simply due to culture and end the explanation there still begs the reason. Well, why did this culture evolve this way and that culture evolve that way? That's where biological thinking comes in.
Give me some other methods that companies could use your research to help sell their product.
Right. So
obviously, we figured what to do if they want to sell their Porsche. Yeah.
Right. So there was a company, I don't remember the exact name of the company, a few years ago that wanted to develop a new type of romance novel. According to them, they thought that the old sort of archetype of the tall, sexy count neurosurgeon who wrestles alligators on his chest was an outdated model of masculinity. And so they wanted to come up with a new guy, who kind of cuddles and sucks his thumb and cries and is very emotional and so on, because they thought that would be sort of a more contemporary version of manhood. Well, guess what happened to that product line?
It didn't sell well.
It didn't sell well. Why? Because they didn't understand human nature, specifically in this case, what are women's evolved fantasies when it comes to, if you like, the archetype of masculinity, right? So generally speaking, to answer your question, marketers who understand human nature will create products that are congruent with human nature, and those who go against nature will have products that will fail.
Now, talk about understanding human nature. I've heard several people say it would be a great idea. There's so much bad news, only hear bad news in the media, to have a newspaper devoted to only good news, heartwarming, warm, good news stories. And they published a newspaper that had nothing negative in it, no negative stories, no stories of deaths or accidents in any way, all positive stories. And it did not sell. It was a complete flop.
Right.
Would that be an example of someone who didn't understand human nature?
Exactly right. So there is something called the negativity bias, which basically is the idea that we are much more prone to listen to negative information rather than positive information, precisely because it has greater impact on our survival. So people want to hear about the guy who was bitten by a shark and the war out there, and want to hear less about feel-good stories.
Well, it's true. And I once remember Valerie Geller, a radio consultant, saying that the main reason, the number one reason that people listen to radio, for instance, is their world safe? Like, right. Is everything okay? And if not, what is it that I should know or take care of?
Well, exactly. You have to ultimately have a prescription. So if you tell people don't smoke, that's not enough. You then have to tell them, what should I do so I could stop smoking? So give them the negative news, then give them the prescription.
A pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Cheers.
Dr. Gett Saad, professor of marketing at Concordia. You want to buy his book? It's called The Consuming Instinct: What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift-Giving Reveal About Human Nature. Coming up, CJAD legal expert, host of the Legal Lounge on CJAD, Chris Demakos, on the aftermath of the ice storm. What happens if your tree falls on your neighbor's car, or the other way around? The answers to all of those questions, that's coming up next. Your questions for Chris Demakos. You're listening to the Tommy Schnurmacher Show on CJAD. Stay with us.
News Talk Radio, CJAD 800, CJAD.com.